I'm really looking forward to this part where we get to get into food population. We're going to start with Claire Kremen, Director of the Berkeley Food Institute and Professor of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Her current research focuses on exploring the ecological, social, and economic benefits and cost barriers to adoption of diversified farming systems and on restoring pollination and pest control services in intensively farmed landscapes, using both predictive modeling and field studies. So please welcome Claire.
Well, thank you so much to the organizers of the conference and the Philomathia Foundation for organizing this great event. In the interest of full disclosure, I will say that I am also an optimist, although unlike Bill Collins, I don't have a dog. But the optimism might be why I chose to come up with such an aspirational title for my talk. And I do want to emphasize that I want to talk about climate change in relationship not just to agriculture, but to the food system. The food system being not just the production of food, but also the distribution, processing, and consumption of food. So since the 1960s, we've had the Green Revolution, a tremendous success in terms of production of numbers of calories, which has actually more than doubled and has outstripped the population increases that have occurred around the same time. And so today we produce actually more food than we even need to feed the global population, at least in terms of calories. However, we still, of course, have many people, around 1 billion, chronically hungry, and we have even more that suffer not just from hunger, but from micronutrient deficiencies. And we have a growing problem with obesity. And unfortunately, often these people that are experiencing obesity may also be subject to micronutrient deficiencies because it's really a quality of food issue, not simply a quantity of food issue. And then 30 to 40% of the food that we produce each year is actually wasted. So in many ways, our food system is failing us. When we think about the environmental implications of the way that we produce food, I'll just go through a few slides rapidly. I'm sure that most of you know these things. But of course, soils are fundamental to production and agriculture. And with tillage practices, we now know that we're actually mining the soils. We actually erode them 10 to 100 times faster than they can be naturally regenerated. In addition, we have loss of soil organic matter and fertility in many of our soils in which we are simply replacing the nutrients through chemical fertilizer, but not replacing the soil organic matter. And that affects 17% of vegetated lands. And as was spoken about in the earlier session, groundwater pumping can be responsible for salinization, which is affecting 20% of irrigated lands. Agriculture is has huge impacts on most environmental issues. So its contribution to climate change is enormous. It's actually bigger than any other sector, including manufacturing. And this comes from deforestation, a principal cause, such as this oil palm plantation in Southeast Asia, from livestock production, methane emissions, and from the uses of nitrogen fertilizer, which releases nitrous oxides. And then biodiversity loss. Agriculture, again, is a major culprit in biodiversity loss. For one thing, agriculture already occupies 40% of the ice-free terrestrial surface, and so has displaced habitat for many species. And this is ongoing in more recent years, from 1980 to 2000. The most important cause of primary forest destruction in tropical forests was actually agriculture. So 50% of new agricultural land uses are actually have taken place recently on tropical forest lands. And from pollutant effects from agriculture, nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution in particular has contributed to the rise and spread of dead zones in the ocean. We now have over 400 oceanic dead zones. And then finally, water use. 70% of the freshwater withdrawals, that is the freshwater that's accessible for for water use. 70% of that is already used for agriculture. And we know that water use in many cases is unsustainable. 14% of rivers running into oceans run dry from excessive withdrawals. And a large number of people live in regions that experience at least 1 month of 100% water scarcity. In other words, places where water use is greater than water renewal. And of course, we have population increases looming. Malcolm is going to talk about that more. And this will put future stresses on the food that we need to produce. In addition, we have changing consumption patterns. And so it's estimated that by 2050, we'll actually have to double food production relative to current levels to meet the growing population and in particular the changing demands due to increased affluence. And all of this we're going to have to take care of under the face of climate change. The lack of sustainability that we have in our agricultural system makes agriculture that much more vulnerable to climate change. We've already heard quite a bit about the kinds of things that climate change is going to bring, so I don't want to go over those. We've also heard about some of the vulnerability that agriculture will specifically have towards climate change, in particular with warmer temperatures, with higher nighttime temperatures, as Max talked about in rice, lower winter chill hours, less snowpack, things like that. We can have decreased yields for some crops, particularly in low latitudes and in seasonally dry regions. We could have drier or wetter conditions depending on where we are. Certainly we'll have an increased frequency and severity of extreme events, which is perhaps the most important thing. There may be some positive aspects in some parts of the world and certainly negative aspects in many parts of the world. So all of the type of effect that will happen is certainly going to be very dependent on local conditions and also on the crop type that is being utilized. In addition to which, what kinds of farming practices are already being in place and what sort of adaptation measures people are taking. So the outcomes are highly uncertain, but it's just one more factor that we need to take into account. So what would it take to create a climate-resilient food system? Well, I kind of want to step back from that question and ask a broader question. What would it take to create a resilient and sustainable food system in general? Because climate change is one environmental shock, but there are other potential environmental shocks that we are facing, as well as social factors and social shocks. So we really need to think about creating a generally resistant and sustainable food system. And I think that we need to do two major things. We need, obviously, to reduce stresses on the resource base, on land, soil, water, energy, biotic and human resources. And we also need to think about the social side. So creating social sustainability as well as environmental sustainability. We need to support the right to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for all. And I think that there's four principal components that could go towards creating this more resilient and sustainable food system. In the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on the first two. The first one being regenerate rather than replace ecosystem services within agriculture. And the second general principle being support small-scale farmers. And you can see the relationship of those two components to the two main bullet items at the top. It's also important that we reduce meat and dairy production and consumption because currently much of the land surface and much of the calories produced are going towards actually producing feed for livestock. About 36% of the calories that we produce go to feed livestock, and only of that, only 4% is actually returned as human feed due to the quite large inefficiencies of feed conversion from grains into meat production. And we also need to reduce food waste. As mentioned earlier, we have 30 to 40% of our food wasted. So all of these forms of waste mean that we're wasting the land, the soil, the water, the energy, and the biotic and human resources that are going in to produce that food that's not actually arriving on the plate or that is suffering from inefficiencies. I'm not going to talk about these last two bullet items, though, because I think that they really follow from the first two. So I want to talk about about this concept of regenerating rather than replacing ecosystem services. And so in a diversified farming system, what a diversified farming system does is to support underlying biodiversity from the genetic through to the ecosystem scale. And it does this through a set of practices that you see in these different colors up here. I think I do have a pointer maybe. So it does this through different practices operating at different spatial and temporal scales. And these different practices can actually produce the key inputs that are needed in agriculture: the nutrients, the water, the soil fertility, the pest control, and the pollination. So just to go through an example, for example, at the plot scale or within fields, the use of compost, for example, can provide nutrients. It can store waters in soils. It can aid with soil fertility. Intercropping can aid the production of or support natural enemies that provide pest control. It can support native pollinators that provide pollination services. So when we look at all of these different techniques, we see that there's a synergistic network of supports between these kinds of practices and the regeneration of these key inputs to agriculture by supporting the underlying agrobiodiversity. But what happens when we change from a diversified farming system whose goal is to produce food, but also to support these underlying ecosystem services through supporting the agrobiodiversity? What happens when we change to a monoculture landscape? Well, in that case, then this linkage between the farming practices themselves and the production of these services in the agroecosystem is broken. And so instead, we have to actually replace these ecosystem services with inputs, which we get from off of the farm. So we replace them with chemical fertilizers, for example. We replace them with groundwater pumping, which we heard about earlier, and the problems that can engender, and irrigation. We replace them with pesticides, and for pollination, we replace it with managed honeybees. And in so doing, we are able to produce a great deal of food. This is clear. The Green Revolution has been very successful in producing a great deal of food. However, it's also clear that we produce many externalities, many environmental ills that we weren't aiming for, and of which I've discussed a few of them already. So, well, how do these more diversified farming systems stack up against our conventional systems that have replaced ecosystem services with chemically intensive farming? I think my slide might be just a little bit messed up here, but let me just explain what this is. I'm going to go through a study that I conducted recently with Albie Miles, in which we reviewed the quantitative evidence through meta-analyses that have been conducted by other scientists on a number of key ecosystem services, comparing diversified farming systems with these conventional monoculture systems. And we also included, when no quantitative meta-analysis was available, we looked at long-term studies, so studies that took place in a place greater than 7 years, or regional studies with a great deal of spatial replication. And so on these graphs here, what you'll see, this S here is supposed to be over here. So what that means is strong evidence, or weak evidence, or equivocal, in support of the diversified farming system having a very positive effect on the ecosystem service in question. So for biophysical indicators, one of the most important is soil organic matter, and there it is very clear that diversified farming systems and organic systems do a wonderful job at protecting soil organic matter and maintaining soil organic matter in the soils. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because I have a few more to throw up, but I want you to get the general picture that for quite a large number of these services, we have strong evidence for the value of the diversified farming system in promoting the service. In some cases, we have weak positive evidence, and in a few cases, there is not enough studies, or it's equivocal. And the other one that I really want to draw your attention to are climate change, and I'm going to go into some more details on these. We have both mitigation components, so for example, carbon sequestration and reduced energy use. Again, very strong support that diversified farming systems do better at storing more carbon and at using less energy. So positive climate effects there on the mitigation side. And then on the adaptation side, the resilience to drought and the resilience to hurricane extreme events, in other words, that we've heard quite a bit about earlier today. And I'm going to go into some interesting examples of these right now. So I want to visit the Rodale trial, which is an experimental farm back east, and they've done a number of long-term studies. In this long-term study, the data presented here comes from 1985 to 1999, and what they did is they compared a conventional, which is indicated as CNB, corn-soy rotation, typical of much of the Midwest, where mineral fertilizers and pesticides were applied to provide soil fertility and control pests, against two different types of organic management systems, one of which had a 3-year rotation, corn, soy, and wheat, and then provided nitrogen fertilizer using legume cover crops instead of fertilizing with synthetic fertilizers, and of course it's an organic system. And another organic system, which is a complex rotation, I believe it was a 5-year rotation, mimicking livestock integration by integrating manure fertilizer. And what the first point is that in terms of the yields between these three different systems for corn, there were no significant differences in yield across all the years studied. But what's really, and that's shown here actually by this red line, this would be the baseline yield across all the studies. But what's important is that out of 5 years in which droughts were recorded, in 4 of those years, the organic systems, one or both of the organic systems, did significantly better than the conventional systems. And in 1 year, there was a catastrophic drought. This was in 1999. You can see that actually up here in 1995. Here's the organic side and the conventional side for the corn part of the rotation. So there was a catastrophic drought in 1999, which dramatically affected yields of all of the systems. But again, one of the organic systems did better than the conventional system. The other didn't do so well due to other issues. But what's interesting also is that in the same really dramatic year, it happened that there was this drought. Here's normal rainfall here. Here's the amount of rainfall throughout the summer. And then in September, there was an exceptional rainfall event, so much more than usual. And they were monitoring water harvesting as well, water capture. And what they found was that the water capture in that month, in September, was doubled actually in the organic treatments relative to the conventional treatment. So during this ending of the drought, when the water really came on in an extreme event, the organic systems were able to actually capture that water. And the difference is really because the soils are so different. The organic soils have much more organic matter in them and are able to capture that water. And that's critical because this morning we heard more about blue water, about irrigation water and groundwater, so surface and groundwater. But there's another type of water that's incredibly important in agriculture, and that we refer to as green water. That's the water, the plant accessible water in soils originating from precipitation. And that's actually a large component of global annual flows, 60% of global annual flows, and it also represents a very large proportion of the amount of water that's consumed by agriculture, 90%, because so much of agriculture is rain-fed. The expanse of agriculture, a lot of it is rain-fed, and even the irrigated agricultural systems are also benefiting from rains. So I want to just go now to an anecdote, and I got this from Tom Philpott, who's a food and agriculture writer, wonderful writer, and he wrote about this fellow named David Brandt, who is farming in Ohio, and there he is, a picture of him. And he's actually doing a farming system that's quite similar to the Rodale trial with a couple of key differences. It's a corn, soy, wheat rotation, whereas most of the people in Ohio and in the Midwest who are growing corn and soy are just doing the corn-soy rotation. So it's a slightly more complex rotation. And in the off-season, he plants a diverse cover crop. It could have as many as 14 species. Some of these will be nitrogen fixing. But he's not an organic farmer. He will use pesticides. He will use synthetic fertilizers when he needs to. The other key thing is that this system is no-till. So he's never tilling the soil. He's just drilling the corn seeds or the soy seeds into the residues from the cover crop. And that's really important. So here I'll just quote directly from Tom's article, his recent article. We start in Brandt's field where we encounter waist-high, deep green corn plants basking in the afternoon heat. A mat of old leaves and stems covers the soil, remnants of the winter cover crops that have kept the field devoid of weeds. At Brandt's urging, we scour the ground for what he calls haystacks, little clusters of dead, straw-like plant residue bunched up by earthworms. Sure enough, the stacks are everywhere. Brandt scoops one up, along with a fistful of black dirt. Then he directs our gaze onto the ground where he just scooped the sample. He points out a pencil-sized hole going deep into the soil, a kind of worm throughway that invites water to stream down. Then we cross the street to the neighbor's field. Here the corn plants look similar to Brandt's, if a little more scraggly, but the soil couldn't be more different. The ground, unmarked by haystacks and mostly bare of plant residue altogether, seems seized up into a moist, muddy crust, but the dirt just below the surface is almost dry. Brandt points to a pattern of ruts in the ground cut by the water that failed to absorb and gushed away. Brandt's land managed to trap the previous night's rain for whatever the summer brings. His neighbors lost not just the precious water, but untold chemical inputs that it carried away. And this is important because, of course, in 2012, we had a killer drought that caused devastation for many farmers. But interestingly, on Brandt's field, he had a normal harvest. So he had stored a lot of water in the soil and was able to he had the resilience that it took to weather this drought. And then returning to some data, in Idaho, on another experimental farm, they've also conducted a long-term study. Again, looking at not exactly the same, but similar kinds of comparisons. And here, again, comparing the conventional system, the typical 2-year corn, soy with herbicides and nitrogen fertilizer against mimicking livestock integration, either a 3 or a 4-year corn-soy rotation followed by small grain legume mix, again, fixing nitrogen, and manure. So they don't actually have the cows in here, but they're mimicking a system that would integrate livestock. Again, these are not organic necessarily. They would use nitrogen fertilizer and herbicide on an as-needed basis, which is important. And what they did is they studied this over time, and what they found is that for the soybean yield and the maize yield, they actually found a slightly increased yields for the 2 organic systems that they looked at. It was actually significant. But the most important thing is the profits are the same between the 2 systems. Labor was higher in the organic systems, but the use of input, synthetic nitrogen input and herbicide, was much, much less for the organic systems. And so it all balanced out, a little bit greater yield, less inputs, a little bit more labor costs. Profits actually equalized between all 3. And profit, in the end, is the bottom line for a grower in determining how they're going to farm. The other important thing, though, is that by the end, after a couple of years of the study, the organic treatments, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be calling them organic because they're not. The longer crop rotation diversified treatments no longer needed to use herbicides to control weeds. All of the different systems managed to control weeds to a similar level, but the conventional system controlled it by using a lot of herbicides, and the other systems controlled it through these rotations. So they have a lot less environmental impacts by so doing. Also, resistance and resilience to hurricanes. I'm not going to go over this slide in detail, but after Hurricane Mitch, there was a study conducted looking at diversified farms versus conventional farms, and what they found was much fewer impacts in these diversified farms. I'm sorry you can't see this slide. It's a little bit too dark here, but here is a big, huge landslide. A lot more landslides, a lot more economic impacts when farms were not diversified. And so one concern, though, is that with these more diversified systems, it's often thought that there's going to be a yield trade-off. So in other words, in the intensive systems, there'll be plenty of crop production, but not too many other ecosystem services provided. In fact, quite a few ecosystem disservices or externalities. But in these diversified farming systems, there'll be lower crop production while some ecosystem services are also provided. That has definitely been a concern, although it's not what we saw in the last example that I just showed you. So the question is there a yield gap? This is some data from from a study that my lab recently conducted. And what we did was ask the question, comparing organic agriculture with conventional agriculture, using organic agriculture as a proxy for diversified farming systems, and ask the question, is there a yield gap? And indeed, there is a yield gap. It's about 14%. So this number here is about at 0.86. Organic production produces a little bit less crop for crop over many studies and many different crops than conventional does. But really, when you think about it, that is not a very large difference. And it's particularly a small difference when you think about the amount of research and development investment that has occurred in industrialized agriculture, particularly since the Green Revolution, but actually continuing to this day. And comparable investment in organic or sustainable agriculture has been very, very small, particularly when you think not only of the public sector, but also the private sector investment. And I'll skip that point because I'm beginning to run out of time. But anyway, the gap is quite small when you consider the sort of the background or the framing. So I want to go on to my second major point, that it's really important that we think not just about the actual farming methods, but supporting the small-scale farmers themselves. Smallholders are critical to our food supply. They produce 50 to 70%, estimates vary, of the world's food. About 50% of these smallholders use diversified, or often other term used is agroecological methods. This represents a lot of people, 2.6 billion people, and 85% of all the farms. But paradoxically, these same people are often those who might be hungry or malnourished. And furthermore, smallholders control less and less of the land base, and mean farm size is actually decreasing in many places. So for example, in Ecuador, the smallholders represent 43% of farmers, but only have 2% of the land. And in India, mean farm size has declined from 2.3 to 1.6 hectares on average over the period 1970 to 1990. Smallholders are increasingly squeezed by consolidated agribusiness corporations that both control access to seeds and to conventional inputs. And some of these same corporations also purchase the commodities. And this diagram here shows, for example, chemical companies like Monsanto or DuPont and their relationship to the seed industry. So many of the chemical companies have actually absorbed some of these seed companies. They're also squeezed by international trade agreements and national policies that favor corporate agribusiness, and increasingly the phenomenon of land grabs that displace smallholders from their lands. So an encouraging counter to these problems is the right to food movement. We're fortunate at the Berkeley Food Institute to have Olivier de Schutter, on which this slide is mostly based, as a visiting professor at the Berkeley Food Institute. He is the special rapporteur to the United Nations on the right to food. So the right to food movement expresses an increasing recognition of the importance of a legal and policy framework grounded in the right to food, which reflects a growing understanding that hunger is not simply a problem of supply and demand, but primarily a problem of lack of access. Based on his work, 25 countries now explicitly stipulate the right to food in their constitutions. Other countries include this in state policies. The right to food movement is comprised of governments, human rights institutions, and civil society or social movements, which I'll get onto in the next slide. The right to food primarily aims to guarantee to each person individually or as part of a group permanent and secure access to diets that are adequate from the nutritional point of view, sustainably produced, and culturally acceptable. As such, depending on the population concerned, the right to food is closely related to the right of access to resources such as land, water, food, forests, and seeds that are essential to those who produce food for their own consumption. And the overall goal here is to address the root causes of hunger and malnutrition with the legal backing provided by this international and national laws, and to move away from food aid towards self-sufficiency. And interestingly, the Right to Food movement, which is a very top-level program, is there's also the Food Sovereignty movement, which is really a grassroots program. It's a global people's coalition seeking radical change to global food systems. The definition of food sovereignty by the Food Sovereignty movement in their declaration is people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Critically, it puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And the food sovereignty movement has taken on many different actions. Farmer-to-farmer training in agroecology around the world has been very successful, also challenging transnational corporations and the World Trade Organization, fighting climate change, seeking land reform, and others. And I think that we're actually at a historical opportunity for the transformation of our food system to one that is more sustainable, more just, more resilient to climate change. Because we have this international top-down kind of effort, the global governance of the Right to Food movement. And then we also have this grassroots movement, the global food sovereignty movement, a bottom-up type of movement. And interestingly, one of the things that kind of links them together is the diversified farming systems or agroecological approach, which is something that the global, that the Right to Food movement sees as a way of advocating for self-sufficiency, whereas from the food sovereignty perspective, it's a way of actually implementing or achieving the goals of food sovereignty. But of course, there are huge obstacles to actually having this kind of transformation that would produce a more sustainable and resilient and more just system. And that's where the Berkeley Food Institute comes in. We're very sensitive to the many obstacles that there are out there. The Berkeley Food Institute began just about a year ago, and our goal is to aid the transformation of the food system towards one that is more diverse, more just, more resilient, and more healthy for people globally. And to do so, we recognize the need to include people at UC Berkeley from many different components of UC Berkeley. So the College of Natural Resources, the Goldman School of Public Policy, the School of Public Health, the Graduate School of Journalism, and Berkeley Law have all participated very actively and very strongly in creating the Berkeley Food Institute, along with students and the community. And I see sort of three main areas of research emerging, but there will probably certainly be many more. This diversified or agroecological farming systems, the adaptation of agriculture to climate change, and social movements and innovations with the potential to transform the current food system are all interesting areas of research. In addition to which, we're very interested in education, communication, and policy. Please take a look at our website, food.berkeley.edu. And I want to thank you for your time. And I think I'm probably out of time, so